right, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
How we doing?
Good.
All right. So the last topic that I did for the Sunday school was the Gospel of Luke. And so I thought I'd take a look for the next, few weeks or so, particularly for the month of November, taking a look at the Gospel of Mark, some of its themes, why it was written, the overview of it. It is different than the other Gospels. It's shorter than the other Gospels. It doesn't really address the birth of Jesus at all. We kind of get right into his ministry, and we find Jesus, interacting with the people, being a teacher, but also there's this aspect of him giving himself to help the people, particularly around miracles, particularly around people that were suffering, people that had illnesses, both physical and mental illnesses. And this is how we are introduced in the Gospel of Mark to Jesus. And so there are some very interesting differences between Mark and the other Gospels. Mark most likely was written first. It was the first Gospel that was written. And it had a particular audience in mind and also had a particular theme in mind. I think the biggest theme that I get out of the Gospel of Mark is this idea of sacrifice, of a servant who sacrifices themselves for the betterment of others. And if we just take a look at Mark, the 10th chapter. We're going to look at 44. This is when, and just some background here, this is when the disciples, James and John and the other disciples were fighting about who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom of God. And so Jesus is going to use this opportunity to get this point across to his disciples. Verse 42, when Jesus called them to him and said unto them, ye know that they which are accounted to rule over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. And so that was an accurate description of what the world was like during the time of Jesus. You had kings and nobles and people of great power essentially telling everybody else what to do. You had a very small group, kind of a pyramid. You ever remember that from history or sociology, the pyramid, where at the top you had the pharaoh or the king, the nobles, some of the priests, and then who was the vast majority of the people at the bottom of the pyramid? Yes, us, right. The vast percentage, 90-95% of the people would fall into that me category, right? The regular people. So verse 43, but so shall it not be among you. You're not to do those things. You're not to lord over other people. But whosoever will be great among you shall be your minister. And whosoever of you will be the chiefest shall be servant of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for many. Isn't that a great verse that encapsulates the life of Christ? That even though he was a king, he was the Son of God. At this time, the most powerful human being in the world at that time, who, as Matthew said during the Garden of Gethsemane when Judas betrayed him, that he could call down, 70,000 angels, I think it was? 12 legions of angels? But instead of lording over or using that power for his own benefit, he humbled himself. He submitted himself, number one, to the work of his Father and the will of his Father. But also he used this great power that he had and this great love and great compassion that he had to help other people. And that's that sacrificial nature of Christ for sure. All right, any questions on that before we go on? All right, so some background basics here. The author, so there's different schools of thought on this. But most likely, John Mark, who was mentioned in the Acts, is thought to be the author of Mark itself, and he's mentioned a bunch of times in the Acts, and we'll just take a look at a few of these. In Acts 12. we're introduced, and when he had, in verse 12, chapter 12, when he had considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying. So John Mark here is one of the faithful individuals after the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Christ, who remained faithful, praying and fasting and kind of keeping together this small band of believers despite kind of this overwhelming tragic event that just had happened in their lives. And they're going to kind of be told exactly what has happened, of course, with Christ, that he has been raised from the dead. There is an incident in the 15th chapter between Paul and Barnabas. Who can summarize that incident between Paul and Barnabas, and John Mark was involved in this? Anyone remember that little story? Yes, no, maybe?
John Mark ran away.
Okay.
And then Paul say, hey, we're not going to have anything to do with him because he abandoned us.
All right.
I want him around.
Yeah, so that's right, Jim. There was a contention, right, between Barnabas and Paul about the usefulness of Mark. That Mark, for whatever reason, had left. He wasn't part of the preaching efforts, and we're not really told why he did that. But Paul said, we're not going to, as you said, we're not going to use him. So let's just take a look at this in the 15th chapter of Acts. Verse 37, and Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia and went not with them to the work. So, as Jim had pointed out, Mark hadn't come with them. They were going to go on a preaching mission, and Mark didn't go. And the contention was so sharp between him that they departed asunder one from another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus, and this is when Paul takes Silas. So there's a contention. They choose different people, and Mark and Barnabas go, and they preach in one direction. Paul and Silas go in the other direction. So the reason for bringing this out is that Mark had intimate details of certainly the life of Christ, but also the acts of the apostles, what happened afterward, the preaching of the gospel. He was one of, you could say, he's one of the core founders of this movement called Christianity. And so he would have knowledge of not only events that took place in the life of Christ, his teachings and his miracles, but he would have certainly been around people as well that would have witnessed these things. And so he had this wealth of personal information, number one, but also he had this wealth of information, that with people that were around him that could tell these stories, and obviously guided by the Holy Spirit as well. And we don't have to look at all of these, but these are just some of the references in Scripture to Mark. Okay, and I'm just trying to give some background and make it clear that he was an important figure in the spread of the gospel. And so it would only make sense that he would be an author of one of the Gospels, most likely the very first Gospel. Okay, so who was Mark written to? It was most likely written to a Gentile audience, particularly a Roman audience, Roman citizens that were, maybe curious about this group of this little Christian cult that was going on, this sect of Judaism. What's the deal with it? Okay, and there's several reasons for this, and we have a few up here. Omits many Jewish references. If you look at, say, Matthew, there are a lot of references in Matthew back to the Old Testament, right? This was fulfilled in the prophet Isaiah. This was fulfilled in the prophet Zechariah, so on and so forth. We don't have a lot of that in Mark. And that makes sense if it was written to a Gentile or a Roman audience, because they would have no inkling to what the Jewish prophets were. The whole purpose of the Gospel of Mark was to introduce a Roman audience to this man Jesus. And that was the first thing. And so that's interesting, right? That's interesting as a preaching tactic. Okay, and so you look at the Gospel of Mark, or not an epistle, but this story, this divine story, this written account by Mark, and he leaves out a lot of kind of the background information, right? He gives background information of Jesus' birth, the connection to the Old Testament, to the Torah. That's interesting, right? I think, he could have certainly put all that stuff in, right? He could have put the birth of Jesus. He could have put all of the references to the Messiah from the Old Testament in this gospel. But he didn't. Because he knew that maybe it would be too much information to the Romans who had no background information whatsoever. Okay, so that's interesting to me, anyways. There are fewer Old Testament quotations. That doesn't mean that it is devoid of any Old Testament quotations. There are still some there, obviously. We just go back to Mark here in the first chapter, actually 2 verses here. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare the way before thee. Now, what is that? Is that referring to Jesus or to somebody else? Who is this quote referring to here? What individual? What individual are we introduced to at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist, okay? And so the account of Mark doesn't begin, as we've already said, with the birth of Jesus. It actually begins with John already being born, Jesus already being born, in the ministry of John the Baptist, okay, preaching in the wilderness and baptizing, okay. And now he's going to quote from Isaiah in verse 3: "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." And so that is one example of an Old Testament quotation there, okay. But it's a very simple, straightforward one, isn't it? It's showing that John the Baptist was sent by God to preach the kingdom of God before the advent of the Messiah, before the advent of the chosen one. And so the Romans would definitely understand that, right? Because in their kind of religious structure, they understood this concept of salvation. They understood that certain people would go before a deity in their own mind. In the Greek and Roman mythology, there was always a spokesperson for that deity. And so they would understand that. Let's see, in Mark 7, 6 and 7. Jesus is going to quote from Isaiah as well. Isn't it interesting, brothers and sisters, that both in Mark and in the Gospel of Luke, which we already looked at, who's the kind of the main prophet that Jesus is going to quote from, and that Luke and Mark are going to reference? It's Isaiah, right? And so I think it shows kind of the power of the prophet Isaiah and how, Jesus quotes quite a bit from Isaiah. And I think there's obviously a reason for that, right? Okay. 6 and 7. "And he answered and said unto them, Well hath Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." Okay, so there's another quote. Now, along these same lines, so we have some Old Testament quotes giving some background information. And I think it shows actually, particularly in the book of Isaiah, the book of Isaiah is a book particularly towards the end, the prophecies towards the end. What are some of the prophecies that are talking about in the end of Isaiah? Anyone remember? Let me guide you down the path where I want you to go. Yeah. Okay. Is the last few books of Isaiah one of the hope and salvation of Israel keeping it to themselves, or is it prophecies of this hope and salvation of Israel being spread out to the Gentiles? Number two. Excellent. Okay, yeah, it is. And before we take a look at this, let's I'll just give you a quick example in in Isaiah. Let's see, 60 something. Yeah, so 62 actually. We already know that Jesus is going to use Isaiah 61 to start his ministry in Nazareth, right? Is it Nazareth? Yeah. So 62, for Zion's sake will I not hold my peace, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until the righteousness thereof go forth as brightness, and the salvation thereof as a lamp that burneth. Okay, so there's this imagery now of light in a dark world being spread out into the darkness. For what reason? And the Gentiles shall see thy righteousness, and all kings thy glory, and thou shalt be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord shall name. Okay, and so there's that imagery again of light and darkness, of salvation, of this gospel message of good news, which Jesus kind of distills down, doesn't he, with the 61st chapter of Isaiah, and says, this is the light, this is the salvation. It's not just Israel's salvation, it is the Gentiles, it is the world's salvation. I am here for the salvation of the world. Okay, and I think if we look at these quotations, you can take a look at these, all of these references go back to the Old Testament. And it's not one of inclusion or exclusion of the Gentiles. These are quotes that are saying or prophesying of a time when the salvation of Israel, those promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are not just going to be for the Jew anymore, but also for the Gentile as well. And I think Mark brings that up quite a bit. And now remember, was Mark a Gentile or a Jew?
Jew.
Absolutely correct, but yes, a Jew. And so, this would be, and we're not told this, but how much did Mark struggle over that, right? Like Peter struggled with, right? Arise, Peter, kill and eat when he saw the vision of God. Think about, all of the times in the Acts of the Apostles where the Jewish converts to Christianity, how they struggled giving up the law. Remember, that was kind of the first council, the Jerusalem council. They had to bring everyone together to figure this out. Do we have to keep the law to be saved? Do we have to be circumcised to be saved? And so they finally came to the agreement that no, we don't have to. So there's explanations in Mark of Jewish customs. Now, if it was written to a Jewish audience, there would be no need to explain Jewish customs to them, right? Just like, kind of American customs. Like, if it was written, from an American point of view, we wouldn't have to explain Thanksgiving to other Americans. We may have to explain Thanksgiving in the background information having to do with Thanksgiving, maybe say from someone from Pakistan or from a remote area in Indonesia or something like that, okay? Because they don't have the cultural background. And so the same is true. The Romans would be like, well, let's take a look at some of these examples here. In the seventh chapter of Mark. So Mark is telling the story of Jesus' interactions with the scribes and Pharisees, right? Verse 1, then came together unto him the Pharisees and certain of the scribes which came from Jerusalem. And when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is to say, without unwashed hands, they found fault. Now, a Jew would completely understand that. Like, you had to ritually clean yourself before you ate. Okay, it was a purity. It was a ritual of purity. Now, we know that scientifically there's a reason for that, right? But I'm not sure the Jews, maybe they did understand the scientific nature of it, maybe they didn't. But there was a ritual of that. It was a cleansing of themselves. And so the Romans would say, a Gentile would say, well, why would they do that? That doesn't make any sense. Why was this a fight? And so Mark is going to explain it to the Romans, to the Gentiles. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not holding the tradition of the elders. So he explains it there. He explains why that this was a thing. Why this was, they were looking down on the disciples. If it was to a Jewish audience, there was no need for them to explain why this was an issue. And if you look at verse 3, it's the Pharisees and all the Jews, right? And so think about the kind of the language that is being used there in that verse. All right, all of the Jews. Again, if it was written to a Jewish audience, that would make no sense. Why would Mark say all of the Jews? Yeah, no kidding, Mark. We know. We wash our hands every time we eat. Let's see, 14. In verse 12. In the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover. Okay, so on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover. That's kind of like saying, to American Christian on December 25th when we celebrate Christmas. Yeah, no kidding, right? And so again, there's some background information, like on the first day of unleavened bread when they killed the Passover. That's some background information for a non-Jewish audience as to kind of the process and the structure of what happened in Passover. Where wilt thou that we go that thou mayest eat the Passover? Okay, so some background information again. And then lastly, in the 15th chapter, just turn to the next chapter here, 15:42. Yeah, this is a good one. And now when even was come, now this is after the death of Jesus, right? Now when the even was come, because it was the preparation, that is the day before the Sabbath, okay? Again, explaining what the Sabbath was and how that you couldn't do any work on the Sabbath, so these preparations had to be done before the Sabbath. If it was written to a Gentile audience, to a Jewish audience, that wouldn't need to be said, right? Everyone understood the rules and regulations of the Sabbath. A Roman citizen who had no interaction whatsoever with Jewish people, just heard about them. Yeah, aren't those the wacky fanatics in the East someplace? They would have no idea what the Sabbath was and what the preparations around it were. So these are kind of some little hints that it was written to a non-Jewish audience. Okay, the explanation of Jewish customs. I think that's a big one. Questions, comments on this? All right. Okay, Aramaic words are explained in Mark. Now, first of all, Aramaic. Whoop-de-doo. What is that? Anyone? What is Aramaic? And why is it important in our discussion on the Gospel of Mark?
Gentiles wouldn't have been speaking it.
So the Romans definitely, Jim, you're absolutely correct, would not be speaking it. Who spoke Aramaic?
Jesus did.
Jesus absolutely did. Actually, along those lines, Jim, Jesus spoke it. All of the Jews in this area spoke Aramaic. It was the common language. It was like English in the Middle East. The Egyptians spoke Aramaic. People in Damascus spoke Aramaic. It was the language that was spoken on a daily basis. And so Jesus is going to be speaking Aramaic. Jesus did not speak Hebrew. He did not speak Hebrew. Hebrew was only reserved, during this time now, Hebrew was only reserved for religious ceremonies. Okay? Great example. Latin. Is Latin spoken today? No. So it would be example like every day we use English, but if it was before, the Vatican II Council, we went to a Catholic church, what language would the Mass be in? They would be in Latin, right? And so Hebrew was used in religious ceremonies primarily. Okay, that doesn't mean that some people didn't speak Hebrew, but there would be rabbis who would understand Hebrew because all of the writings of the Old Testament were in Hebrew. But the spoken language during the time of Jesus was Aramaic. And so it makes sense that when Aramaic words are used in Mark, Mark has to explain some of these words. I'll give you an example. Let's look at Mark 3. When he's talking about James in verse 17, he's talking about ordaining the 12, calling the 12 disciples, right? He says, Simon, he's surnamed Peter, in verse 16, and James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, he surnamed them Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. Great nickname, right? And, you know, who knows why they were called that. Maybe they were always fighting, they were arguing very loud, right? Like when you go over to the Deneen's house for a birthday, it's very loud. Too loud. So Boanerges it's an Aramaic word. And so he had to explain that. He's explaining it to a non-Jewish audience, so exactly what that is.
Is that your license plate?
Thankfully, no. All right, so let's see, Mark 5, verse 41. This is Jairus' daughter, right, being raised. And he took the damsel by the hand and said unto her, Talitha cumi, which is being interpreted, right? He's interpreting what that saying is now. Damsel, I say unto thee, arise. Okay, so he uses the Aramaic phrase there, but he explains it to a non-Aramaic speaking group of people, to a non-Aramaic speaking audience. Okay, wouldn't make any sense. It kind of reminds me of what Paul said. You know, I'd rather have one word spoken in a plain tongue than 10,000 in an unknown tongue, right? And so I think Mark is kind of using that. Hey, I'm going to put the exact saying of Jesus exactly as he said it, but I'm going to interpret it for my audience so they understand it, right? If this whole thing was just kind of Aramaic sayings and they couldn't understand Aramaic, then we're not getting anywhere. And let's just look at one more of these. And let's see, Mark 7:34. Now this is in verse 32, just for some background information. And they bring unto him one that was deaf and had an impediment of the speech. And they besought him to put his hands upon him. And he took him aside from the multitude and put his fingers into his ears. And he spit and touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said unto him, Ephrathah, that is, be opened. Okay, another explanation of what these, that's like a different word. Romans, the Greeks and Romans would not be familiar with that. Okay, so I think here's the thing with Mark. Mark wants to be faithful to the actual events of Jesus' life, and he wants to be faithful to the actual words that Jesus spoke, particularly when he's healing somebody, right? Jairus' daughter, he said specific words. Mark states them very clearly, but interprets for his audience. Jesus heals a deaf and a dumb man. He says certain things to this individual and does certain things, which is recorded, but Mark interprets for his audience so they understand the full picture. Okay, does that make sense? All right. Here's another little interesting one. Uses Latin terms in place of Greek. Okay, so the Greek language obviously is prevalent in the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Romans, a lot of them would speak Greek. But what was the common language of the Roman world? It was Latin, right? And so it was the tongue that people are going to converse with, number one, but also it was the language of business. And so in order to be, in business with the Romans, you had to learn their language. And so that kind of, I'll give you an example, a modern day example. The most spoken language as a first and second language is what language? So Mandarin Chinese would be the most spoken language by itself, right? If it was just your primary language. But if you look at all of the people that speak English as a primary and a secondary language, it's English. Okay, and so, and that kind of makes sense. Who kind of ruled the waves for a long period of time, for about 150 years? It went all over the place. The British, right? The British Empire. Sun never sets in the British Empire, or India, or in Australia, or New Zealand, or over in America. So they had this massive empire. In order to trade and to do business with Britain, you had to learn their language. And now you have America too, who's kind of doing the same thing in a slightly different way. But again, in order to do business with the wealthiest nations, with the most powerful nations, you have to learn their language, and that obviously makes sense here as well. Okay, but Greek actually was a spoken language. A lot of people spoke Greek as well, and in fact, when the Christian church, when the Catholic Church splits in 1091. One of them is going to be called the Roman Catholic Church, right? What's the other? What's the Western part?
Greek Orthodox.
Okay, Greek Orthodox Church, right? What's the main language of the Greek Orthodox Church? Greek. Okay, very good. And so it's still spoken there as well. All right, so let's just take a look at that in the 4th chapter. Let's see. And he said unto them, is a candle brought to be put under a bushel or under a bed, and not to be set on a candlestick? And so the candlestick word there is actually a Latin word. Okay, and so instead of using the Greek there, he's going to use the Latin word for candlestick. Now, why he does that? Did the Greeks have a term for candlestick? I don't know, but he does. So there's some changes in some of the tenses, and there's some, not necessarily the tenses, but he uses certain Latin words in place of Greek. Okay, and so again, this would make sense because maybe it's a translational issue. So instead of using a particular Greek word that maybe his Latin audience didn't understand, he's going to replace it with a Latin word that his Latin audience or his Roman audience would understand. So this actually brings it to another point. The translation of this is really impressive. And you can understand Mark being guided by the Holy Spirit as well, right? He's got to take Aramaic, right? These maybe some accounts in Aramaic. He's got to translate them into Greek, right? Because Mark is going to be translated into Greek. That's the language of the New Testament, by the way. Okay, even though Latin is going to be spoken, all of the Gospels are going to be translated into Greek. Because the majority of the people in and around the Eastern Mediterranean are going to be Greek speakers. And so there's this kind of language fight going on between Latin, as Rome grows more powerful, and Greek as well. But the majority of manuscripts, by the way, are going to be written in Greek because it was the language of academics. Okay? If you wanted, after, following in the traditions of Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, right? All of these Greek philosophers. And remember, Alexander the Great is going to spread Greek ideals in the language throughout the Middle East, right? All the way from Macedonia, let's see, your side, Macedonia in the east, all the way to India and Pakistan in the west. And so the Hellenization, you ever hear that term? The Hellenization of the world is going to occur. And so it makes sense from this point of view that Mark would use Greek because it's the best way to get the message across to the most people, the gospel of Jesus. Well, what language are we going to use? We're certainly not going to use Hebrew because only a few people use it. We could use Aramaic, sure, we could use it, but that's not going to spread the gospel message to the most people in the shortest amount of time. So Greek is going to be used. But Mark is also conscious of the fact that there are going to be Romans that are going to use this. And maybe there's some Greek words that maybe they don't understand. Maybe you ever got to use a Latin word in place there. It's interesting. And then mentions the wife who was put away. Let's look at this in 10. So this is again kind of another, it's a cultural thing, isn't it? Now, this is the only place in the four Gospels that this event is mentioned. And it's the woman caught in adultery, isn't it? Okay? And so there's the explanation of this as well, right? Now, why do you think, and there's no real right or wrong answer here, but maybe it's just something for us to think about. Does this kind of, go hand in hand with the fact that it is being written to a Gentile audience, that's being written to a Roman audience or a Greek audience? That this event here of Jesus showing compassion to a woman that was caught in the very act of adultery. I don't know. It's the only place in the four Gospels that this event, and it's really one of these incredible stories, but it's only mentioned in Mark. Why is that? Don't know. Questions, comments on this, on the background information, on why most scholars feel that it was written to a non-Jewish audience. Okay, yes, Jim, go ahead.
Just one more on the cross, the Aramaic, when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?
Eli, lama sabachthani. That's a great one, yeah. Forgot about that one, Jim, yeah. Which is being interpreted, my God, why have you forsaken me? Yeah. If you were an Aramaic speaker, you would know exactly what the original Aramaic would say. Great, it's a good one. Thank you. Anything else on this? All right, this is a good place to stop. We've given ourselves some good background information on the Gospel of Mark. Next week we're going to get into major themes of the Gospel of Mark, and look at some of certainly the parables of Jesus, but also how Jesus is portrayed when he first comes onto the scene in the eyes of the Romans, right, of the non-Jewish audience. Okay?